God has perfect knowledge, understanding and wisdom. Perfect knowledge is the accurate possession of all facts. Perfect understanding is the full perception and interpretation of the facts. And perfect wisdom is the proper application of the facts. In fact, the Bible in 1 Corinthians, it tells us that the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom. And as we know, the New Testament was written in Greek, and the word for foolishness, the foolishness of God, the word used in the Greek there is the word moros. It's where we get our word moron from. It's not normally a nice word. It's not a word that you would actually pay anyone a compliment with by using it. But what the Bible is saying there is that even the weakness of God, if it were possible, even the moronic understanding of God, if it were possible, even that would be far superior to the greatest wisdom and understanding that man could ever possess. So the foolishness of God, not that God is foolish, but he's saying that even if he were, God's weakest understanding and God's foolishness is still wiser than man's wisdom. And the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. And that's good, because we come to a God that is not going to change his mind. We come to a God that is not going to have to, as we said, reevaluate, readapt, think through differently the situation that we bring before him. Because he understands all things, he knows all things. When God brings a verdict, or God through his word communicates with us, we know that it's true. We know we can depend upon it because he has accurate possession of all the facts. Sometimes we make judgments, don't we, when we don't know the true facts. We hear something and we instantly say, well, that's not right, and we start to go down a particular path. And then we find out later that we didn't really have the true facts when we made our judgment, and we really, got it wrong. But when God says something in his word or declares something in the scriptures, we know that God does so on the full understanding of all the facts. Why? Because he is omniscient. And the first one there that we've looked at is that his knowledge is complete. Now the second one that we come to is that God is infallible. Because he knows everything, he is infallible. That means he never gets it wrong. He never makes a mistake. Because he knows everything perfectly in past, present and future, he will never, ever, ever make a mistake. Only God is infallible. We, sorry to disappoint us, all of us, we are not infallible. We get it wrong sometimes. We make mistakes because we don't know everything. As we start to get older, did I tell you it's my birthday tomorrow? I don't know if I mentioned it this morning. Yeah, I think I did. But as we get older, how often do you hear people say, I wish I knew what I know now when I was 20? It's because our knowledge increases as we grow older. But God doesn't. God knows as much now as he did last week. He knows as much now as he will in 3 years' time, because only he is omniscient. And that omniscient nature is translated in the infallibility of God. He will never get it wrong. He is actually incapable of error or omission. Have you ever read a document or a statement? Little words at the bottom, error and omissions accepted, because people make mistakes. But God does not make any mistakes. The book of Zephaniah in the Old Testament, the Lord does no wrong. Morning by morning, he dispenses his justice, and every new day he does not fail. It is unthinkable in the book of Job that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would pervert justice. And it's because of this infallibility that God is qualified to be the judge of all mankind. The Bible tells us that one day we will die and stand before God in judgment. And because of his omniscience, because of his infallibility, the verdict that God gives will be the right one. It's not a case of getting a good brief or a good lawyer or a good solicitor to put forward a good case, and hopefully we can sort of pull the wool over the judge's eyes. It's not a case of that. When we stand before God, he knows everything about us. He knows all the intimate details of our lives. But what that does mean, not to frighten us, what that does mean is that his judgment is perfect. His judgment is perfect. It will always do the right thing. Often we hear about cases, legal cases, where there's been an error, and sometimes people have been in prison for a long number of years, and then some fresh evidence has been unearthed, or maybe something was withheld originally. That is also known to be true sometimes. And then the person is acquitted after all those years. But because God knows the full facts, and he's also a God of justice, we know that when he judges, it will be perfectly. His judgment will be accurate and perfect. And thirdly, how do we translate God's omniscient nature into our lives? Nothing can be hidden from him. Nothing can be hidden from him. Right at the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 3, when man fell, Adam and Eve, we read about them, they sinned. And what did they do? They recognized that they had fallen from their privileged place before God, and they tried to cover themselves. They tried to hide from God. Literally, they covered themselves with fig leaves, but also they hid and tried to keep themselves away from the gaze of God. I can remember very clearly, as if it were yesterday, Becky, when she was just a young girl, say 2 or 3 years of age, a toddler really. And whenever she did something wrong, what she would always do was this. And she would cover her eyes because she thought that if she couldn't see us, we couldn't see her. Which of course is not true. And in many ways, even adult people do the same thing before God. Religion without Jesus can be just a form of covering. It can be a form of people trying to present an image before God. I go to church and I live a good life and I do my best. But really, we're hiding behind the covering of religion. Good works. Well, I'm going to go to heaven because I do this and I do that and I do all these wonderful things. Hiding behind another front that we put on in our lives. But the truth is that God can see through all of those. All of our excuses, all of our persuasive arguments might convince our fellow man, but it will fall really on stony ground if we stand before God with that argument that we've been a good person because we did this or we did that. Thinking of Becky, again, embarrassing me this morning. She was about the same age, 2-3 years old, and we had a dog. We always had a dog. It was a lurcher called Ben. And she was sitting down, colouring as kids do. And, you're there, you're keeping an eye on her, but you sort of go here, you go there, whatever. She's just sitting down colouring. Turn around, and we had an emulsion wall, which was covered in crayon. Covered in crayon. So I said to her, Becky, who's done that? She said, Ben. She said, Ben's done it. And do you know, that's just what Adam and Eve said way back in the beginning. When God came, he knew what they did. When we ask our children, who's done this, we know they've done it. But what we do is we give them an opportunity to admit the guilt. We know they've done it. So God said to Adam and Eve, what have you done? He knew what they'd done. He knew the consequences of what they'd done. But he gave them an opportunity to put it right.